Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everyone, to GenX Classic Sports. I'm your host, Sean Enos, and today we're going to kick off, I don't know if it's the actual kickoff, but we're going to help kick off football season, the first few weeks of it at least, with this discussion about pro football training camp. All of us Gen Xers know what training camp was for pro football when we were younger. It's a remote location for summer practices, and this was common all the way up from the, infancy of the NFL up until the 80s and 90s and beyond. But now, by the way, 26 teams in the NFL. Was there 32 teams exactly? So 26 teams in the NFL hold their camps at their normal training facility. So they don't travel and go out of town anywhere for training camp. 26 of these teams. So that's interesting. And maybe we'll talk about some of the whys on that. But anyway, you're here because you're of a certain age, probably. And, you remember what training camp meant to us as young fans. For a football fan who grew up in the 70s and 80s like us, training camp's just one of those things that makes you think about a college campus somewhere, probably, and a bunch of football players living in dormitories. I've seen news footage on ESPN or wherever of guys walking into camp with their pillow under one arm or maybe a television or something. I think there's a famous picture somewhere of Jim McMahon or somebody walking into training camp with a case of beer. I mean, over the years, we've seen this footage and we know what we're talking about. Coaches walking around, man, with those bad shorts, carrying clipboards, and you're hearing the whistles blow and helmets and shoulder pads popping and players lined up, man, in some August sunshine for sure. And then the fun starts. Hitting. 2-a-day practices and full pads, full contact, conditioning, running, meetings, more practice, more hitting, more running, more conditioning, more film. And somewhere in the middle of all that, some poor rookie's wondering if he's actually going to make the team. And some veteran is probably wondering if somebody younger is about to take his job. And a coach is wondering how much punishment his players can take before they finally become the football team that he really wants. So that's the training camp that most of us grew up with. And it probably harkens back to most of us growing up with memories of our own 2-a-days for high school football. But here's something you may not know. The NFL didn't necessarily invent training camp. The concept goes back to the earliest days of organized football. And, colleges really started it, and it didn't begin as a punishment situation. It's not punishment. It began because football players needed some place to learn to play the game and get into shape before the season. So over the decades, it just evolved. And by the time we got to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, training camp had become one of the defining rituals of pro football. We all know that. I mean, that's what you had the countdown for. Countdown to training camp, right? And I might add, remember, this was the days before year-round coverage of football. When the Super Bowl was over in the 70s and 80s, you didn't hear about football again until the draft, and you barely heard about it then. It was not the draft, the scouting combine, and then you just had a couple of months until training camp or whatever, but you didn't hear about all that stuff. You barely heard a blip about the combine and the draft, and you really, after the Super Bowl, you didn't hear much about pro football, period, until some countdown for training camp in July. So, the NFL didn't invent it, but that's certainly who we associate with the idea of training camp. So, it's just football school. That's what it is. It's part military boot camp. It's part job interview, part endurance contest. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the history of NFL training camps. Where did they come from? Who created this whole thing? Why did NFL teams start disappearing on the college campuses every summer? Was this considered normal? Why did coaches, coach the way they did, and all these kinds of things. So we're going to start before the NFL back in the 1890s. That's right, the 1890s. There is no NFL. There isn't even anything resembling modern professional football. And football is primarily a college sport. And college football is still developing, and players are obviously students, and the coaching staffs are small. You might have one or two dudes coach a whole team. Everything's primitive facility wise by today's standards and equipment wise. And there's no year-round football culture. Okay, nobody is arriving, in April for some kind of rookie camp or organized team activities. Nobody's spending May and June in a weight program, in pro football. Nobody is working with a sports scientist to calculate exactly how much, VO2 max these guys have and all that fun stuff. If you wanted to get ready for football season, you had to get ready for football season. And as I believe it was Bill Parcells said, football players play football. And that's when the early training camp concepts really started kicking in, is that college teams began using periods away from the normal campus routine, to bring players together. So none of this stuff that the pros do now was happening. Obviously, high schools weren't doing it. Colleges started doing it. They take the team somewhere to keep them together and practice football hard, and get them in shape, because nobody worried about being in football shape in the off season. They just didn't. And like I said, it's not about punishment. It was about preparation. And there was an advantage getting away from the campus, or, separating football players from their normal routines and locations, perhaps allowed the coach to make football the center of everybody's world. And so that idea eventually became the important feature of professional training camps. It just took a little while to evolve into the institution that we know, because professional football began adopting training camps before there was an actual NFL. Back before the actual NFL, when there was a lot of teams in the Midwest playing each other in these loosely organized situations, like the old American Professional Football League, or whatever it was called. One of the examples that we can trace this all back to was the Minneapolis Football Organization, and in the late 20s, around 1927, from what I can gather, the Minneapolis Red Jackets were using Clef Camp near Grand Rapids, Minnesota as a training site. This is believed to be the first pro football training camp. And the routine sounds pretty familiar. The team used the camp, for organized preparation, including conditioning, football practices, two-a-day football practices. And like I said, this idea wasn't new. It was they were starting to kind of figure out how to handle business as a pro organization year round, and that was a lot different from today's NFL. The American Professional Football Association was formed in 1920 and became the National Football League in 1922. So the first NFL teams, they were existing and operating on shoestring budgets. George Halas being the example everybody always talks about. In the early days, George Halas wasn't merely the coach. He carried equipment. He wrote the press releases for the team. He sold tickets. He taped ankles. He played. He coached. Eventually, he owned. I mean, it wasn't even close to a modern professional sports organization. It was just a small business trying to survive in those days. And that explains another part of training camp history, really, which is that early professional football players didn't make enough money to just play professional sports. Football didn't pay them enough to support themselves and families year round. So training camp wasn't just about learning the playbook. It was time when the team had to turn a collection of working dudes into a football team, guys that were out selling insurance and being policemen or firemen or whatever they did for their regular job. They had to shut it down and get together and get ready, get their bodies and their minds ready for football. So, we all know this, right? But around the 50s, somebody smart in the NFL realized that college campuses were built exactly the way they needed to be for hosting an NFL training camp. There was no other kind of facility like it. So a college was perfect. They need housing, they need food, they need practice fields, locker rooms, meeting rooms, classrooms, weight rooms, and a place where you could keep 100 football players together and, to sleep and work out together. And colleges, that's what they were, right? So the NFL teams increasingly rented space at colleges just before the fall term started. Usually you needed the month of July and some of August, and then you were out of there, and then the college kids could move in. So by the 1960s, this was just the pattern for everybody. The Baltimore, the old Colts, they were at McDaniel College in Maryland, for example. The Chicago Bears were at St. Joseph College in Indiana. Cleveland was at a place called Hiram College in Ohio. Dallas back then was at St. John's Military Academy in Minnesota for a while. Then they were at Pacific University in Oregon for a while, and they finally settled into California Lutheran for about 30 years there in Thousand Oaks, California. Green Bay was at a place called St. Norbert College in Wisconsin. The New York Giants were at Fairfield University in Connecticut. I pulled dates, I pulled locations from mostly the 60s, but just to pick a decade, I'm talking mostly where these teams were during the 60s. The Pittsburgh Steelers, they were at the University of Rhode Island for a while, and then St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. The 49ers were at St. Mary's and UC Santa Barbara out in California. The Washington Redskins were at Occidental College in Los Angeles and Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So they went out to the West Coast like the Cowboys did. So basically, the NFL figured it out. College campuses were a cheap place to rent. They were functional, they were isolated, and they had all the things you needed to conduct football camp. And of course, that isolation was an important part of the equation. You had to live and train together, and that's what these guys finally figured out around the 1960s en masse, basically. Although obviously it had been happening since the 20s with different results for different people. So imagine being an NFL rookie, in the 70s or something, and you finally made it to pro ball, and you've gone from college football to the NFL. You're at the peak of your profession. And what do you get as a reward? You go back to a college dorm room. You're back in a room, probably with another guy that you're sharing, with that small bathroom, probably a cinder block walls all around you. You get a twin bed and a dresser and maybe a desk and not much else. Now, some teams rented enough space that the veterans especially didn't have roommates, but the rookies a lot of times were stuck with a roommate. And back then, you were going to live there for almost 2 months, several weeks. The average was around 7 weeks of training camp, sometimes 8. The players ate together. They traveled to practice together if they had to travel. They attended meetings and watched film together. They practiced together, obviously. They went back to the dorm together and hung out. They lifted weights. The team controlled their schedule. The coach controlled the entire football operation. You were so isolated and running by a military-like schedule. And therefore, you were never away from your teammates and coaches. And a lot of that is not that way anymore in pro sports, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Modern players kind of train together, but they don't necessarily live together in this way anymore. And back then they did. Like I said earlier, 26 out of 32 teams now practice at their normal facility. So they're living in their normal house, sleeping in their normal bed with their wife and their kids there at night, and then they're going to training camp at the regular old office, so to speak. Back then, no, everybody packed a bag and left. And that's what coaches wanted, cohesion, suffering together out there in the heat, eating together, learning together, and competing together. And eventually, if everything went right, you became a team. All right, so let's talk about a few examples of this. One of classic NFL training camp belonged to the Minnesota Vikings. This is just a bunch of them I pulled. The Vikings began using Bemidji State college for training camp around 1961, and in 1966 they moved to Mankato State College. I think that's Minnesota State, Mankato now, not sure. And they stayed there for 2 decades. And that started in 1966. And the initial agreement called for the Vikings to be there from July 13th through August 31st. So roughly 7 weeks. And the Vikings, of course, used the campus housing, the dining facilities, the practice field, actually 3 practice fields plus the stadium. And that's what exactly the old school training camps looked like. Players were moving in and living on campus and there for a while. And, fans were showing up. And to this day, I don't think very many teams, I may be way wrong about this, but I know some teams do not charge a nickel for you to get in for training camp. If you can show up, you can go. Parking, that may be a different situation. And obviously concessions and T-shirts, I'm sure they're selling all that stuff. But I believe it's been fairly traditional for training camp attendance for fans to be free. Vince Lombardi, he's got one of the most famous training camp stories of all time. In July of 1961, the Packers were arriving for camp, and they had just played in an NFC or an NFL championship game. Really talented team, experience, and expecting, of course, to continue where they left off. And Vince Lombardi wanted to take it so far back to fundamentals that he famously stood up in front of the football team holding a football in his hand and said, "Gentlemen, this is a football." And that is one of the most famous coaching stories in American sports. And the point really wasn't that Lombardi thought his players didn't know what a football was, of course. It was that he wanted to go back to the fundamentals of blocking, tackling, assignment football, execution, all those basics, even with professional athletes, even with veterans, even with players who had just played for a championship. And his method became legendary. Have you ever seen the image of Lombardi running around in whatever kind of pants? I guess they were football pants. I don't remember, but I know he had some kind of uniform on, and he had what looked to be thermal underwear top on, long sleeve, and he's standing at a chalkboard. And there's footage of him explaining the Green Bay Packers concept of a sweep left or a sweep right. And he's drawing up what 11 men on the field are doing. That's where it started with him. And they ran that play to perfection because they ran it over and over and over. And that was where he believed in starting, all the way back to the very basics. He believed that mastery came from repetition of the fundamentals. And the Packers in 61 proved him right. They went 11-3. And they beat the Giants 37-0 in the NFL championship game. And then the following year, they won another championship. So, he knew what he was doing, because ultimately he won 5 NFL championships and 2 Super Bowls. And so people do think of Lombardi's training camps as pretty brutal, but they're remembering more than just hitting and tackling. They're remembering how Lombardi was like a college professor, and he was teaching his system to those guys, and they were sitting there like a bunch of students, not just football players. And so the mental side clearly was very important to him, and you needed training camp to have time to absorb all of that stuff and get your mind on it. So now let's talk about one of the things that made training camp so brutal, and this is something even guys my age and way older can all relate to if they even played high school football, and that's two-a-days. 2 practices in the same day, and in some eras, they might have practiced 3 times. There's a story about the Redskins back in the 70s when George Allen was coaching. George Allen had 2 practices during the day, and he had a nighttime walkthrough. Now, I don't know the AM and PM times exactly on all that, but let's just assume they practiced at 8 or 9 a.m., 1 or 2 p.m., and then again at 6 or 7 p.m. with a walkthrough. And that happened for 7 or 8 weeks. Man, I've got a feeling those guys had enough of training camp by the time they got out of there. One of his players remembered that Allen did not allow players to have water breaks because he believed that weakened you as an athlete. It weakened your endurance to have these water breaks. Now, I knew a man that played football with my father in the 50s in high school, and this man went on to play college football in the late 50s, and he told me that where he played down in Louisiana at Louisiana Tech, which was a pretty good program for a small college back then. He told me that they were the same way. Like they withheld water from them for these entire 2.5, 3 hour practices in August. And he just could remember that there was like a dairy bar nearby the campus, and he would go buy the largest soda he could afford after practice because they withheld liquids from them. And after practice, that water that he could finally get just wasn't good enough, so he would have to go buy him some kind of soda. And so that was a normal thing in the 50s and 60s and 70s and actually beyond. And we'll talk about the beyond part in high school in a week or so. So think about that. 2 practices and a walkthrough with no water breaks during those workouts. And before somebody younger is listening to this says, no, that's not possible. Well, it was possible. That's just how the football culture worked back then, and that's how unsophisticated the thinking was with the training and endurance aspects of it. Discomfort was part of the process. You didn't train around fatigue, you trained through it. Coaches yelled about knowing how sore you were, you had to work through it. And they all talked about getting tougher and condition yourself, push yourself, don't quit, and so forth. Let's talk a little bit about some specifics to the money and stuff, because I always try to talk about that. I don't know why. George Allen's training camp here's another example from his training camp. In 1977, George Allen opened training camp in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And just to put it in perspective about how money has changed over the years, in 1977, the rookies were making $200 a week during training camp. And veterans made about $250 a week during training camp. And then they got a higher amount of money once the preseason games started. But the Redskins, it broke down to something like $17 per day per player on food and lodging in those dormitories that they actually had to spend for food. So $17 per player per day on food, and about $24 per week in lodging for a pro football player in 1977. And they're paying them $200 or $250 a week. So the entire training camp apparently cost around $15,000 for the pro team, and that's including renting the college space. So that kind of makes you stop and think about these guys were putting themselves through a lot of misery for not much money, even by their standards as pro athletes in 1977. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So yeah, teams had to eat, and so colleges had cafeterias, and someone cooked for them, and so you ate what the team gave you. Training camp meals were totally communal, and the team had the training table set up, and players ate together. And nutrition was important to refuel the body, but the science behind it wasn't what it was, or wasn't what it is now. Yeah, certain players had to lose weight, and certain players had to gain weight, and they could plan for that accordingly. That was pretty simple. But all this stuff now that they go through about with a sports nutritionist calculating every single micronutrient in the body and counting grams of carbs versus proteins versus fats and all of that, that didn't happen. They didn't have that kind of knowledge back then. The idea back then was eat enough to refuel yourself for practice tomorrow in the heat tomorrow and so forth. Because like I've already told you, they didn't even drink water a lot of times. So, they did have to feed them to keep them upright, but that's about all they cared about. So speaking of water, let's talk about the heat. It's August. And, a lot of teams traveled because they went to cooler climates. The New Orleans Saints went to Minnesota to escape the heat in the South. The Houston Oilers would go somewhere. Dallas Cowboys went out west to California and Thousand Oaks. Now, I'm not saying it's not hot in any of those places, but mostly these teams picked combinations or places that didn't have the combination of heat and humidity that they had at their own training facilities. So your southern and southeast type teams, usually went out west or up north somewhere to try to cut down on I'm not saying it was perfect conditions, but the Thousand Oaks heat was a different kind of heat than Dallas heat. So we'll talk about that in a minute too. So yeah, the heat could be brutal. and depending on where they were in the country. But heat was something that you had to tolerate. And so you had to balance the concept of it not being so hot you can't get anything done versus you have to get acclimated to the heat. And, dehydration and heat illness are real medical dangers. We know that now. People have died from it. But in the old NFL, showing that you could withstand heat was treated as evidence of toughness. Like, that takes us back to the George Allen thing, withholding water from him. 2 practices and a nighttime walkthrough for him and no water breaks. So, sounds insane. But listen, here's another famous example of this. When Jimmy Johnson took over the Cowboys in '89, they had already locked in to training camp in Thousand Oaks, California, because of a more moderate climate. And when that contract expired, as soon as he could get them out of it, he did. And he moved them to the sweltering Texas heat of Wichita Falls and Austin, Texas. He ran padded practices and conditioning in that kind of heat 2-a-days if he could. And he believed that would give his team a major mental edge and a physical edge over the course of a long season, because he had sort of affirmed that belief when he was pushing his teams down in Miami in college. So when he got to Dallas, no, he did not want a better climate out in California. He wanted the heat. He wanted to put on the full pads, and he wanted to hit out in that heat. And that's what they did for the Jimmy Johnson tenure in Dallas. The coaching philosophy behind training camp was, coaches were authoritarian back then more so than now. They weren't trying to be your friend at all. They were coaches, and their philosophy was basically you don't know what you're capable of until someone forces you to go beyond what you think you can do. And so it produced some pretty ugly practices at times, and they were pushed past reasonable limits. The players were a lot of times. Injuries were treated a little bit differently. And because players believed that admitting you were hurt was a sign of weakness, and they thought the coaches would see it that way for sure. And that's just, all those things are still part of that old school football mythology that deserves a lot of caution now that we know better. And the players weren't necessarily tougher because their bodies were better. They were tougher because their culture really demanded it of them. So injuries have always been a part of football. They always have, because it's a violent physical sport. But the medical understanding of football injuries back then in training camps, nowhere near what it is today. Concussions, think about it. Concussions weren't understood. The heat illness wasn't understood. Soft tissue injuries weren't managed the same way. And so the phrase play through the pain was still very much part of the culture. If you could walk, you're gonna practice. If you could practice, you're gonna play. And if you couldn't, there was another guy waiting to take your job. And, that's not something to be romanticized anymore. These old guys that are having the problems will probably tell you that. The old training camps were physically demanding, but that toughness that a lot of the players ended up with, they didn't have a whole lot of choice about it. And that's kind of the truth about it. Now, let's also keep in mind that these training camps were scheduled in and around the preseason football games. And folks, back then, it's hard to believe, because are we down to 3 preseason games now? They just changed from 4 to 3. Well, back then, 60s and 70s, there were 6 preseason games, folks, 6, along with in the middle of those 7 or 8 weeks of training camp. So, you might have a couple of weeks of training camp to get ready, and for the next 6 weeks of training camp, you're playing a game at the end of every one of those weeks. And some teams played in the Hall of Fame game, and that made it 7 preseason games. Think about that. Before you played your first ever regular season game, you've already got 6 to 7 games in your, on your list. So it was a different time. And these games back then weren't exhibitions for the starters. These things were evaluation tools, which they are almost exclusively now. The coaches had these big rosters. You got 100 guys, you're trying to cut down to basically 50, 53 technically, and plus a little practice squad. So they needed to see guys perform in the pressure of actual games. So the preseason was an extension of training camp, and training camp was an extension of roster evaluation. And so one big giant process: get into shape, learn the system, be evaluated, either get cut or not, get evaluated again, play a game, either get cut or not, be evaluated for another week, either get cut or not, and then do that enough, and it's time to start the season. So when did things start to change? By the time we got to the 1980s, training camps still looked familiar to the previous 2 decades, but things were starting to change a little bit. The NFL was becoming a lot more commercial, and players were gaining more power, and the players' union was becoming more influential and gaining more power. And the union's job is to stick up for the players, and the business of pro football was changing, but the culture of camp, even though it was old school, 2-a-days were a part of life, and college campuses were still used, and coaches still believed in the physical preparation. The 85 Bears supposedly had just a really physically demanding training camp, and obviously it worked. It was in Platteville, Wisconsin, by the way, and it was sort of famous for how rough Ditka was. Ron Rivera later said that Ditka just cussed us the whole time and wouldn't stop. And he would ask Ditka later why he pushed him so hard, and Ditka said, well, I'd never ask you to do something I didn't do, which, Ditka came from the era before this when it was even more brutal. And Ditka was a Hall of Famer, so his standard was really, really high, and that's old school football. And even though the game was changing around them, there were still some of these guys holding out that old school mentality. But like I said, the players really things started changing because professional football was moving towards more of a world in which the players had more leverage, and with leverage came control of their working conditions. And we're talking the late 80s. The Bears, in the mid 80s, won that Super Bowl after that tough training camp with Ditka, and things kind of started changing around that time and shortly thereafter. There's not a single moment to point to, but it just sort of gradually turned this big boat around because players' salaries increased and the union got a lot stronger, and the off season became more structured, and teams developed their own training complexes. Instead of going off and borrowing a college's facilities, they just built their own. The weight rooms got better, medical knowledge improved, the knowledge about conditioning improved, and dehydration and stretching and soft tissue and rehabilitation and all these things improved. And so the league was kind of forced into placing tighter restrictions on practice. And the biggest change came in 2011, the NFL rolled out a new collective bargaining agreement. And that new agreement, which is the rules in which the NFL must abide by for its players, the NFL explained that training camp, as we used to know it, was pretty much over. 2-a-day practices were gone. Teams could conduct 1 full contact padded practice per day, and then additionally just only have a walkthrough. And the NFLPA similarly described the 2011 agreement as ending training camp 2-a-days forever, and also limiting contact in practice. And so that was the end of an era. That wrapped it up in 2011. It was gradual from the late 80s on, but in 2011 they really dropped the hammer on all of these changes because of the players' contracts. So the new rules for training camp, just to give you an idea of how much it's changed. On the first day of camp, teams are allowed to do 3 things: administer physicals, spend time in meetings, and carry out their physical tests. There are absolutely no on-field activities allowed except for running and conditioning tests. There's no practice. On the second day, players and coaches can take the field and perform non-contact drills, including gap drills, star drills, outside leverage drills, and cutback drills, because those things focus on technique and repetition. But they're still limited. No pads and no contact means participants can be in shorts and in helmets. Day 3 of training camp follows the same set of rules as day 2, and things don't change until day 4. From day 4 through the end of training camp, teams are able to get in a groove and find a sense of normalcy pretty much. Teams can conduct 1 padded practice per day and 1 walkthrough. The padded practice can last no longer than 3 hours, and 3 hours has to pass before coaches can trot players back onto the field for the second practice of the day. So you can practice for 3 hours. You have to wait a minimum of 3 hours to do another practice, which is required to only be a walkthrough. In total, the 2 practices can last no longer than 4 hours. So if you hit for 3 hours, your walkthrough is only 1. In total, the 2 practices can last no longer than 4 total hours. A padded practice that lasts for more than an hour cancels out the second practice. I did not know that. This means that the team is done for the day if they have a padded practice that exceeds an hour. And then they must wait a full 24 hours until their practice time starts again. And additionally, the NFLPA says it's mandatory that teams have 1 day off per week. And by the end of camp, head coaches must give their players at least 5 days off, a lot of Saturdays or Sundays. Some coaches award more days off depending on the energy level and tempo of practice. So there you go. That's kind of the new structure of it all. So they've obviously moved away from what we grew up watching during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, before sports science, before individualized nutrition plans, and before players had their own personal recovery programs, and before the NFL ultimately could tell coaches how long they could practice. There was just a football field, a whistle, a coach, and a whole bunch of tough guys trying to prove that they belonged. So that's it. That's my take on training camps in the NFL. Those guys went to camp, they suffered together, they learned together, and then they competed together. And when they walked out of those hot, miserable August 8 weeks or 7 weeks or 6 weeks of camp, they were supposed to be ready. They were supposed to be ready for all that football that entertained we Gen Xers, right? Anyway, I thought that'd be a fun glance back and a fun way to kick off things this football season here in August. So I appreciate you spending 30 or 40 minutes of your time with me. As usual, we appreciate you if you'll comment, like, share, subscribe, do all the things you can do, but mostly tell people about us because, hey, we keep it PG around here and we try to entertain everybody we can, from the young ones to the old ones. So this has been Sean Enos, and we'll be back in a week with some more GenX Sports.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.